So we're going to review what we did yesterday because you will need that for today. So I asked you, you had these 4 questions for homework yesterday, and we were talking about the greatest common factor, and that's what your job will be today. So I'm going to take this up, so hopefully you have this out and that you're following along and you can check to see what the greatest common factor is. So I have 2 numbers here for my first one. It was 45 and 35. I gave you the suggestion, we always start with the smaller number. And then we list all of the factors of the 35. And hopefully you would have had 1, 5, 7, and 35. And those are all of your factors of 35. Now, to figure out the greatest common factor, what I have to do is then take each of these numbers, 35, 7, 5, 1, and see which one divides in evenly to 45. What's the biggest one that divides in evenly? So you would then take 45. So I'm going to, again, write out what I'm typing in my calculator. You don't have to write out this step. So 45 divided by 35. If I take that, 45 divided by 35, I get a decimal, 1.29. Well, I know 35 can't because that does not divide in evenly. I can then do 45 divided by 7. This is what I'd be plugging into my calculator. 45 divided by 7, that gives me 6.4. Again, that doesn't divide in evenly. So then I would take 45 divided by 5, which gives me 9. So this becomes my greatest common factor. My greatest common factor is equal to 5. Now, some of you may not even need to write down all of these steps, which is fine. I would encourage you to do that. Some of you, again, if we're not very strong with our multiplication skills, that's okay. You will need to do this, and it may take you a little bit longer. So for my second question here, I have 16 and 12, so I start with my smaller number. And I list all my factors of 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 12. So once I listed all those factors there, I would go 16 divided by 12. I type that into my calculator, and I get here, it's 1.3, so I know it's not 12. Then I would do 16 divided by 6, and 16 divided by 6 gives me 2.6, so I know it's not 6. Then I would do 16 divided by 4. That does give me 4, so 4 is my greatest common factor. So I write greatest common factor is 4. Okay, that's what you should have done for your homework. And similarly here, I'm just going to tell you what the answers are. The greatest common factor between 10 and 50 is equal to 10. The greatest common factor between 49 and 56 is equal to 7. So that's what you should have gotten. That's what we practiced yesterday. So hopefully you're getting the hang of it because this unfortunately does not go away. Okay, so you already have this glued inside your notebooks. It says factoring out the greatest common factor of a polynomial. So I talked about this yesterday. Factoring is the opposite of expanding. So we know here when we expanded, we used a FOIL. So I would get x squared plus 3x plus 2x plus 6. X squared plus 3x plus 2x plus 6. And that gives me x squared plus 5x plus 6. This is expanding. This is in expanded form, this piece here. This is in factored form. So this is factored. This is in expanded form. Or in standard form is what we have. Okay, so our goal is we're going to be looking at here common factoring, again, writing what's in brackets. And again, just as a reminder, you always have the option to use the algebra tiles. So as you're doing your homework, you can do that. You're more than welcome to. But again, for those of you who find the algebra tiles difficult, you, again, are going to want to pay attention to kind of how we do this. Okay, basically, in a nutshell here, it says find the largest number that divides evenly into each term. That is the greatest common factor. That's what we've been practicing doing. Find the variable with the smallest exponent to take out of all terms. Okay, this piece here we haven't done. You can factor out a number and you can factor out a variable. So that piece here, that's going to be a little bit new today, but we're going to practice it today, and then you'll practice it tomorrow as well. Then it says here, take the number and variable from step 1 and step 2, and this becomes your greatest common factor. A common factor can be a number or a letter, or a number and a letter. So just keep in mind there's 3 different cases there. And then what we need to do is we need to then write the common factor first, and then brackets, then divide every term by the common factor. Okay, so I'm going to go over some of these pieces or as an example here. Okay, there's 2 pieces we need to look at. One, the coefficient, which we should be pretty familiar with, and the other one is the variable, which we're not really familiar with. Now, I could do this using algebra tiles, but we're not going to. My goal here will be to do the greatest common factor. Now, you don't have to write this step out again if you need it. I'm just trying to show you what's going on as I'm doing this question. So I have here are my numbers, 5 and 10. So I start with my smaller one. My factors of 5 are 1 and 5. And I see which one of these can divide evenly into 10. Well, we know 10 divided by 5 gives me 2. So 5 is my greatest common factor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write here, greatest common factor is equal to 5. And now I have to look at my variables. So when I look at my variables, this has an x2, this has an x1. I want to take the smallest exponent. What's smaller, 2 or 1? 1 is smaller, so I'm going to common factor out a 5x. So what happens here is I'm going to leave a little bit of space. I know you don't have very much space, but you can kind of work with it. 5x is my greatest common factor. That comes first. Now, what comes next inside my brackets? I have to take this greatest common factor, and I'm going to divide everything by 5x. Okay, what happens when I put 5 divided by 5 into my calculator? 5 divided by 5, that gives me 1. Now, if I have an x2 on top and an x1 on the bottom, what I do is I subtract the exponents. 2 minus 1 gives me 1, so that's why I get an x1. I have a minus. I can put in my calculator 10 divided by 2 gives me 2. And then x divided by x, that's like saying 1 minus 1, which just gives me 0, so I'm left with this. Now, do you have to write this exponent 1? No. But that's what you get. That is me common factoring out a 5x. Now, to check my answer, so you can technically do this entire unit and get perfect on it if you check your answers. How do I do that? I check it using the distributive property. If I use the distributive property, so here's my check. I would take 5x, multiply it in, 5x squared. 5x times negative 2 gives me negative 10x. And you should get the exact same answer. These should be the same. Okay, so our big task here is to figure out the greatest common factor. We look at the numbers, we look at the variables, and then we divide every term by that. So it's a little bit tricky. And like I said, the only way we get better at this is if we practice. Okay, so inside your notebooks here, we have some examples. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to write out, this is my greatest common factor. I have to figure out what that is. And again, some of you may not need to write this step down, and that's okay, but some of us will. So I'm going to start with 6 and 18. All of my factors of 6 are 1, 2, 3, and 6. When I figure out what my greatest common factor is, my greatest one, I can do 18 divided by 6. That gives me an even number. So 6 becomes my greatest common factor. That's my coefficient piece. Now, if I look at my variables, I have an x and I don't have anything. So because there isn't an x in every term, I can't use that. I can't use an x, so I'm going to write 6. Oops, sorry. Okay, so what I have to do is only 6 is my greatest common factor. So I write my greatest common factor. I'm going to leave a little bit of space. I put a bracket, and I'm going to divide every term by 6. So what happens here? 6 divided by 6 6x divided by 6 just gives me x, or 1x. 18 divided by 6 gives me positive 3. And then we're done. Okay, the next one here, again, I have two numbers, 4 plus 20y. So again, I want to find my greatest common factor. So again, here I will write out my two numbers. I'm actually going to write it maybe to the left just because I have a little bit more space. You can write it wherever you have enough space. So I have 4 and I have 20. So I look at my smaller number. My factors of 4 are 1, 2, and 4. Hopefully you're able to figure this out. If it's 1, 2, and 4, 20 divided by 4, that divides in evenly. So 4 is my greatest common factor. If 4 is my greatest common factor, what's my next step going to be? Well, I don't have any variables, or I only have 1, so I can't common factor out anything. So I write my greatest common factor 4, and I divide everything in here by 4. Now, 4 divided by 4 does not give me 0. That's a common mistake to write. It gives me 1. Plus 20 divided by 4 gives me 5y. That is my final answer, 4 bracket 1 plus 5y. Okay, my next example here. I have three numbers now, 8, 4, and 24, and it works the same way. So again, I'm going to kind of do mine on top here where I have a little bit of space just to show you. So I have 4, 8, and 24. I'm going to start with my lowest one. I always start, and I write out my factors of 4, which are 1, 2, and 4. And I'm going to do a check. 24 divided by 4, that gives me 6, so it works with 24. I then have to check it with 8. 8 divided by 4 gives me 2, so 4 would be my greatest common factor. So I'm going to write here, greatest common factor equals 4. Now, again, there's no variable that's common here, so it's just 4. So I'm going to divide everything by 4. On my next slide, I'm going to write 4, which is my greatest common factor, then a bracket. I can now do this division. 8 divided by 4 gives me 2x squared. 4 divided by 4 gives me 1, so I'm going to write 1 plus x. Plus 24 divided by 4 gives me 6. And that becomes my final answer. That's all we have to do. So finding the greatest common factor is probably the trickiest piece there. You divide by that greatest common factor every single term, and then you write what's left over. On my next piece here, so again, I have two terms here, so I'm going to write it out. I'm going to do a different color here. So I have 18 and 9. So I start with my smallest number. My common factors of 9 are 1, 3, and 9. I can check, okay, which one would be the greatest common factor? See if you can figure that out. Hopefully you would have seen that your greatest common factor is equal to 9. So, and then there's no variables that are common. So what I have to do here is I'm going to write 9 bracket. Oops, before I should have written that. I should have divided. So I'm going to divide everything by my greatest common factor, which is 9. I go 9 bracket. Okay, when I do this math, 18 divided by 9 gives me 2a squared. 9 divided by 9 gives me positive 1b squared. Okay, hopefully we're getting the hang of this. Okay, my next two down here that I'm going to do. So again, if I look at my coefficients, I have 100 and I have 50. I'm going to start with the smaller one. So I would look, and again, you have a multiplication table that you can look in where you're going to try and find all of the 50s. So all of my numbers are, I can do 1 times 50 gives me 50. 2 times 25 gives me 50. 5 and 10 give me 50. So I then have to go through each one of those factors and say, okay, which one's the biggest? 50, so I start with 50. 100 divided by 50 gives me 2, so that works. 50 is my greatest common factor. So that means, so I'm going to write it here, greatest common factor is equal to 50. So I divide everything by 50. So on my next line here, it's my greatest common factor, bracket. See if you can write what goes inside your bracket. Okay, when we do 100 divided by 50, I get 2x squared plus 50 divided by 50 gives me 1y squared. Do you have to write that 1? No, you don't, because it means the same thing if you don't write it. Okay, that would be my greatest common factor, and that would be my final answer in factored form. Okay, the next question that we have here. So now this is getting a little bit tricky. So if I look up here, my numbers are 1 and 3. Okay, well, my only factors of 1 are 1. My factors of, and that's it. So 3 divided by 1 gives me 1. So my greatest common factor here is 1. Now there's also something else that I can factor out here. If you look here, I have an x squared and an x in both of those terms. So I always look for the lowest exponent. The lowest exponent here again is 1. So I'm going to write here the lowest exponent. So that becomes 1x. So what do? I divide by 1x, divide by 1x. So on my next line here, I have 1x bracket. Okay, when I divide by my x's, I subtract the exponent. So that's saying there's 2 x's on the top, 1 on the bottom, so I'm left with 1, or 1x, plus 3 divided by 1 gives me 3. X divided by x, that cancels out, it just leaves me with 3. So I have 1x bracket 1x plus 3. That would be my final answer. Okay, so that might be a little bit tricky when we're dealing with the exponents, that we have to subtract the exponents to get our new answer. Okay, we're going to do some more practice. So we have, I think, is it what, 4 more examples left, 6 more examples left? Okay, so if I look here, I have an x cubed, an x squared, and an x, and all the coefficients are 1. Well, that kind of makes it pretty easy. My greatest common factor, because all the coefficients are 1, is just 1. Then I look for the lowest exponent, because every single term I've highlighted with a variable. My lowest exponent, again, here is 1. So I take every term and I divide by x1. So what do I get? I write out my greatest common factor first, and then I write my bracket. Okay, what can I do here? 3 minus 1 gives me 2, x2. Plus 2 minus 1 gives me x. For my third term, this is saying 1 minus 1, which is 0. This cancels out. That actually gives me with 1. It doesn't just disappear. I need 3 terms there, because remember, when I have to do FOIL, I have to end up with that term there. Okay, and that would be my final example, or my final answer, sorry. Okay, our next example. So I actually have some numbers here. So I'm going to write them up here. So I have 3, 4, and 6. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my lowest one, which is 3, and I'm going to write the factors of 3 out. 1, and 3. Those are the only factors. So if I go through, so 6 divided by 3 works out evenly. 4 divided by 3 does not work out evenly. So I can't use 3. I can use 1 though. 6 divided by 1 gives me 6. 4 divided by 1 gives me 4. 3 divided by 1 gives me 3. So my greatest common factor here is 1. Now I look at my variables. I have a x5, x6, x4. I take the lowest of them. The lowest exponent is x4. So again, why can I common factor that out? I have an x here, an x here, an x here. And x is attached to every single one of those terms. Because an x is attached to every one of those terms, I can factor it out. So I'm going to divide by 1x4, 1x4, 1x4. Okay, so I write my greatest common factor out, 1x4 bracket. Okay, my next line, it's 3 divided by 1, which gives me 3. x5, x4, so 5 minus 4 gives me just 1. Plus, 4 divided by 1 gives me 4. I have an x6 and an x4, which gives me 6 minus 4 gives me 2. My next one I have here, plus 6 divided by 1 gives me 6. x4 and x4, 4 minus 4 gives me 0, so I don't write any x's. So that becomes my final answer. Okay, the next example, I have 6x squared plus 12x. So again, if I start here, I'm going to start with my lowest number, and I write all my factors of 6 out. 1, 2, 3, and 6. Again, if you can tell me what the greatest common factor is right away, great. You don't need to do that. You don't need to write this step out, but if you struggle with it, I want you to write this step out. So again, I start with my top one, which is 6, and I can test here. 12 divided by 6 gives me 2, so 6 is my greatest common factor. So I write GCF is equal to 6. Now I check, does every term here have an x? I have an x, I have an x, so I do. So I look at the lowest exponent. What's the lowest exponent? X. So I have 6x, that's my greatest common factor. So that means I'm going to divide everything by 6x. On my next line here, I'll write is equal to 6x bracket. Six divided by 6 gives me 1. I have an x2 and this is an x1 here, so 2 minus 1 gives me just 1. Plus 12 divided by 6, that gives me 2. I have two x's here, there's a 1 here and a 1 here. 1 minus 1 gives me 0, so I don't write anything there. So that's my last answer, or that's my final answer. Okay, my next piece here, my greatest common factor. So here are my, take my lowest number, which is 4. I'm going to write out all the factors, 1, 2, 4. And I'm going to test them out. So I take 16. 16 divided by 4 gives me 4. So that's my greatest common factor, which is 4. Okay, my next step, what I have to do is I have to look at my variables. I have an x4 here, an x2 here. So that means every term has a variable, which means I can common factor that out. So I look at my lowest exponent, which is 2, x squared, or x2. So I divide every term by 4x squared, divide by 4x squared. On my next line, I write equals 4x squared bracket. I want you to take a minute and I want you to put in what you think you're going to get when you divide everything by 4x squared. Okay, so what you should have gotten, 4 divided by 4 gives you 1. I have an x4 and x2, which gives me x2 when I subtract those exponents, plus 16 divided by 4 gives me 4. X squared, that cancels out, so I'm just left with plus 4. Hopefully you got that right. Okay, my next example here is a little bit blurry, sorry. So I'm going to do it in a different color just not to confuse it. So I have here my greatest common factor. Well, I take my lowest number, which is 7, and I write my factors out for 7. 1, 7. Okay, and then I check. I have to check. All 3 terms have to be able to divide and evenly into that. So 28 divided by 7, that works. 14 divided by 7, that works. So 7 is my greatest common factor. Then I look, does every term have a variable? Yes, yes, yes. So I look at the lowest exponent. What's my lowest exponent here? X, because that has a 1. So it's saying I have to divide every term by 7x. Divide by 7x, divide by 7x, divide by 7x. So 7x, bracket. See what you get when you do it. You should get x squared plus 2x plus 4. 7 divided by 7 gives you 1. 3 minus 1 gives you 2. That's where I get the 1x squared from. 14 divided by 7 gives me 2. X squared on the top and x1 on the bottom leaves me with 1x. 28 divided by 7 gives me 4. 1 minus 1 gives me 0. Okay, our last example here. Again, I'm going to start with the smallest number. The smallest number here is 4. So I write my factors out of 4. 1, 2, and 4. Okay, and I start. I go piece by piece. Does 8 divide by 4? Yes, it does. Does 12 divided by 4? Yes, it does. Does 4 divided by 4? Yes, it does. So 4 is my greatest common factor. I then look, does every term have a variable? This has x5, x4, x3. So I take my lowest exponent, which is x3. And what do? I divide every term by 4x3, 4x3, 4x3. So 8 divided by 4 gives you 2. x5, x3 gives me x squared minus 3x plus this one, last one here is a little bit tricky. 4 divided by 4 gives you 1. I have x3 on top, x3 on the bottom. 3 minus 3 gives me 0. That means I have no x's. Oh, and that would be my answer, except for I missed a really, really important piece, which is 4x squared. That's my final answer. Okay, so you're going to have a worksheet. We're also going to be working on common factoring tomorrow, but you really, really need to practice. Take your time when you're doing your worksheet, and then I can take up any questions you have tomorrow.